We've been through all sorts of locales in the process of filling out this list. We've been to the moon, to Mars, and we've even gone outside of our own solar system. We've seen some of the wildest landscapes of a ruined Earth, but now, to complete the top 10 of our list, we're going to have to go through hell and back. Okay, not literally, but naming your track Hell is a pretty strong statement about what to expect, and it certainly doesn't disappoint. It's a gauntlet of tricky turns and jumps, and it never stops being difficult. And that's before you consider the mushroom cut. But in the same breath, Hell also has plenty of thrills to temper the frustration. Things start off innocuously enough, with a sequence of challenging corners before we get to properly peel out down a straight. Then we're transported into the volcano once more by way of a portal. Business as usual for the ever exuberant environment, but this is Hell, so everything's ramped up to 11, especially the ramps. Back in Opportunity, I mentioned that I enjoy jumps that are involved, and this one definitely fits the bill. The best part is that this isn't even the height of ridiculous jumps in the course. Excess airtime is bad, so you want to adjust your pitch just so that you'll be flush with the track when you slam on the boost. And then you've got to contend with one of the worst chicanes in the entire game. The track curls, so you can't see it either, and if you hit a wall, you're going to ricochet into the other side of the track thanks to the speeds you'll be going at. It's my least favourite section by far, and getting it right yields more relief than satisfaction. The next section is the tamest part of Hell, and tame by the standards of any other track, but it's much welcomed after everything else encountered so far, and with what you'll encounter immediately after. Once more through a portal you'll go, and once more you'll get to see daylight. You won't be enjoying it for very long though. This mushroom forest is already a nuisance casually, but when you start doing the cut, it becomes utterly diabolical. Fitting for the track it's on. The main reason as to why is, for once, the kill planes. For once, they actually do their job, and they do it very well here. Here's a hot tip. Aim for this section of the track as I do. Pitch up for a split second when you launch, then immediately pitch down to avoid hitting the ceiling. Then adjust as necessary to keep yourself in that fine margin between being airborne and being dead. So 2 ridiculous jumps so far, one seemingly not intended, but the greatest jump is just around the corner. I don't think I need to add anything here. The scale of this says plenty enough. There's a fiddly corner or two before a final leap towards the finish, but who cares really? This is the end of the lap. Or rather the end of Hell's mission statement of being a daunting obstacle course. At least until you start the lap again, and again, and again, and again. Stuck here in eternal damnation. Hell is the most varied volcano track, its longest and its hardest. It is a great many things, and one of those things is also maddening. Were the second chicane and the mushroom cut kill planes a little more forgiving, this would easily be a top 3 contender. But even despite those niggles, Hell remains a wonderful track to drive on, one of the most intense experiences of the entire roster. Abruzzo might not be my outright favourite environment, but it's one of the most consistently enjoyable, even in spite of Unmanned. Look no further than the fact that 3 of its tracks are up here in the top 10. Bridges is the worst of the 3, but that really doesn't mean anything this far up the list. Much like battling for top lap times, the rankings here are divided by thin margins. Here we have a smooth, fast track, which squanders none of its length to redundant or unmemorable gimmicks. The first one can be found right at the start. Yes, this cheeky gap in the wall will catch you out your first few times round here, and then it'll come back to trouble you much later on when you're a wall bouncing expert. Because the fastest way around the first turn is to go in as deep as possible and bounce off the edge of the wall. We'd go even further into it were it not for, well, you can see the problem, can't you? This is just the first corner too. the rest of the lap continues to be just as finicky, starting with this half loop. You'll want to stay as close to the centre of the track as possible, as the embankments on the edges can easily jostle your ship and cause you to lose speed before you even start to correct that behaviour. Staying central also allows you to better deal with the twist that appears in the road as the loop levels out. The hairpin is the slowest part of the course, and you'll need that time to prepare for the latter half of the circuit because it fails to pull any of its punches. Take a wide line as you exit the hairpin so you can give yourself the best possible angle for the chicane, and then get ready for the following loop. The principle remains much the same as the first. Keep to the middle as much as possible, or you're going to get tossed about like a ship in a stormy sea. You also need to be mindful of the exit too. The easiest way to tell if you've gotten a good exit is whether or not you feel like there's 2 corners here, or 1. Consequently, this is where you can drop several tenths in one go. The final corner is the easiest part of the back half, but don't take it for granted. Take it the same way you would the first. Run into it as deep as possible to give yourself the straightest line on exit. That similarity in approach makes it a nice way to bookend the circuit, yet Bridges isn't quite done. On your way to the finish line, it gives you a huge straight to whirl down, which is technically 3 straights connected by portals. There's nothing to it in terms of driving, but the rapidly changing viewpoints offer an amusingly excessive spectacle to round things off. I don't have too much else to say about Bridges, but I don't think I need to. The appeal of it, I would think, is obvious. It's fast, the driving technique is nuanced, and the backdrop is gorgeous. It's quintessential Redout, in other words, and that's why it sits comfortably in the top 10. Welcome to the last MS track on the list. Solar Farm, similar to Trailblazer, feels like a melting pot of other tracks, but looks beyond the moon for its inspiration. The first corner, for instance, evokes memories of Alaska Speedway, with the speed at which you'll lunge into it, and how crucial a good wall bounce is for the entire lap. There's also the pipe tube section, where you start on, and later on in the lap will fly over, similar to Neon Crystals. But if I'm to make any comparison to another track, it has to be Shipwreck. They're both MS tracks after all, and without the power-up, navigating them becomes a brutal ballet of wall bounces and damage limitation. It invites creativity and aggressive driving to overcome the inherent time loss from not using the meta power-up, and that's right up my alley. There's no one show-stopping moment in Solar Farm, but rather a series of moments encountered when driving in anger that really add to the visceral feeling of this track. The aforementioned first corner, which is then followed up by skirting perilously close to the ledge of the canyon, kicking up dust along the way. The elevation change with the hairpin is prominent as it looms over the track preceding and succeeding it, giving you the briefest of moments to read the track before you're plunged into it. The solar panel jump isn't as grand or as thrilling as I think it should be, at least not when it's the name of the circuit, but it's fine enough. It's an exercise in strafing at odd angles to maintain speed, and flirting dangerously with kill planes. The jump after it pretty much dwarfs it though, with its speed, sense of height, and maybe sense of occasion too. You get a lot of airtime, so you also get a lot of time to admire the scenery, and also anticipate the next corner. The third and final jump certainly doesn't want to be outdone, maybe not in terms of speed or spectacle, but in terms of importance. At the end of it you have a hard left. Landing early makes it easier, but ultimately slower, so guess what time it is? Yep, wall bouncing time. This one in particular makes me feel like I've wandered into a Beyblade arena with the way I get pinged off the wall. It's a curious but not unwelcome feeling. Can't dwell on it too long though, because between you and the finish line lies a trio of corners in rapid succession, each trickier than the last. Doubly so if you're on your high horse like me and don't like using magnetic stabilizer. To reiterate for the final time, I love challenging corners, which is why I don't enjoy MS, because it removes a lot of that challenge. With that in mind, I love tackling this sequence, and it ensures the lap ends on a high note. Solar Farm condenses the shipwreck experience. While I appreciate the latter for its sheer ridiculousness, Solar Farm trims off a lot of the fat and creates a track that's focused, fast, and remains tricky to beat, both in terms of driving it and the quality of that driving experience. This track is Genesis for me. When I decided to join the Redout Discord and become a part of its community, one of the first things I latched onto was the 7-day challenge, wherein a new track is selected every week for people to practice on and post their best laps for bragging rights. For me and my scatterbrain, it was the perfect excuse to hyperfixate on something and improve at the game so I could stop coming last in every single online race. In this context, Swift Passage was the first track I ever did a time trial on. To call it a learning experience would be an understatement. In that week alone, I far better understood the intricacies of the ship I had stuck with in the career, the track itself, the importance of shortcuts, and much more besides. But we can't talk about Swift Passage without talking about its cut, can we? I reckon it's one of the more infamous cuts in the game, and it's certainly one of the more outrageous ones visually. I've gone back and forth a long time on this shortcut, on whether or not it's good for the health of the track, and at this point, I'll settle on it being a positive. Getting consistent with it is certainly not easy or enjoyable, but once you get over that hump it's gratifying, and it skips the slowest and worst section of the entire track, so it's just a win-win situation. I went over this track in detail with one of Redout's greatest players, Striker, in his Redout Advanced Strategy Guide, which you should totally check out when you have time. I don't want to repeat too much of what I said there, but I will adapt and expand on a quote I used to describe the appeal of this track. Swift Passage is a track that evolves. Encountered early on in the game, the challenge is simply to get around it, deal with its corkscrew section, try not to crash into anything on the jumps, and especially not the portal frame at the end. Then, as your time and experience in the game grows, the focus shifts onto figuring out the boost pattern, the precision required to take the corkscrew cleanly, reducing steering input as much as possible, and then, the cut. Things don't just end there though. No, it never ends, really. Redout's skill ceiling is immense, and there are so many optimizations that can be made. For me, Swift Passage is a tapestry that details my progression in Redout, and every time I have come back to this track, I've added a few new rows to it. Ultimately, this pretension could be made of any of the 60 tracks in the game, but Swift Passage is the one for me. Whenever I've been uncertain of my ability, I come to this track to get a measure of myself, and I've never walked away from it uncertain or unsatisfied. Are there better tracks out there? Yes, 6 of them to be precise. But none of them feel more like home to me than this track. This track passed me by for most of my career in Redout, but like quite a good few entries this far up the list, the 7-day challenge helped me to realise what I had been missing out on. Beyond this being the introduction to pipes to fledgling players, Seaside Hills otherwise appears as a fairly average track. As so often is the case however, once you have a few feathers in your cap, the identity of this track changes. For Seaside Hills, that identity becomes a persistent battle of millimeters, for not only do you have very little room to move about here, but you also have very little margin for error. I know that sounds like one and the same, but a particular part of the track will prove otherwise. We'll get to that in a bit, but first we have to talk about this initial section, as it's the reason why this track got shot so far up the list. Out of the first corner, you get to wrangle with this pipe, and taking it without significant speed loss is a nice little appetizer to the rest of the track. Once you're out of it, you've got to take a hard right, then a left, then a right, then a left, then a right, then a left. That's no exaggeration either. The track really does zigzag that much, and with roughly the same cadence as I've just read that out in. Combined with a fairly pinched road, Redout briefly becomes more like a traditional racing game. drawn lines that cut through multiple corners as cleanly as possible, though we can't fully escape the wall bouncing here. Still, it doesn't take away from the satisfaction of stringing these corners together. Your reward for doing all of that is a small straight to stretch your legs on, one of the few places where you can actually do that here. Enjoy it while it lasts. After the next turn, we come to the section of the track where tightness and margin for error become mutually exclusive for a moment, mainly because it isn't a section of track at all. You have the road down below, of course, but that's not in our best interests of being fast. The alternative then is to maintain your altitude and try rejoin the track at the crest of the hill. The problems of this are twofold. First is the crest itself. It's a very precise spot to land on, as going just a little bit too far forward will have you headbutt a kill plane, and too far back will see you landing on the slope and waving goodbye to all of your speed. This feeds into the second problem, which is maintaining enough height to land perfectly, but not so much height you overshoot and, well, you know the rest. See? Tiny margin for error, but you've got all the space in the world to manoeuvre. The remainder of the lap returns back to the canonical style of driving you'd see in other racing games, which means that the floaty ships of Redout can have quite a tough time keeping a good line here. This corner leads us into the final flourish of the lap, which, considering mere seconds ago we just circumvented a hill, you can imagine how this is going to go. And just like before, you have a kill plane keeping you humble all the way to the finish. Considering what I said about Mountain Road in the previous part, about it being a track that transforms, there's definitely a connection that can be made between it and Seaside Hills. In the case of the latter though, it's never looked quite as docile. You can attribute the initial sequence of corners to that feeling. While Mountain Road might interest me more, both in terms of visuals and how its driving experience has changed over the years, Seaside Hills definitely offers a more consistently entertaining one. Grazie, Abruzzo. Stockholm Syndrome. That's why this track is so high on the list. Obviously, that isn't the whole answer, but if this were Facebook, my relationship with Mobius would be set as, it's complicated, so do allow me some time to break this down. I didn't think much of Mobius until I started doing every platinum in the career mode. At that point, I had gotten good enough that each platinum only took a few attempts, with two notable outliers. Debris Trophy was one of them, of course, but before that I had to contend with the second hardest platinum in the game, a pure time trial situated right here. With a string of victories beforehand, the Dunning-Kruger effect was in full swing for me, but the Neptune Chrono event gave me a healthy dose of reality. What had been a few attempts apiece now became several hours in one event. I didn't realise it then, but Mobius had already gotten its talons lodged into me. When it reappeared in the 7-day challenge, I was ready to give it some much warranted payback. Imagine my joy when I saw that Acera OAT was also the meta here. Finally, on even ground, how would I compare with all the pros who had poured hundreds, if not thousands of hours into the game? This would be the truest test of skill, and I was determined to prove myself. With that mentality, Mobius sprung its trap, and has left me entranced ever since. Few tracks could be described as ominous, but Mobius pulls it off with aplomb. The deep space architecture is the only thing you can see here, and it clings around the track as desperately as you do. There's not much in the way of light here, save for the illuminated indentations in the track, and the orange glow of the tunnels. It's hardly an inviting atmosphere. Then again, there is no atmosphere here. The hostility of Mobius, and Neptune at large, isn't just conveyed for the aesthetics, it's carried for the soundtrack as well. Aram Shabazians isn't a musician, he's a goddamn wizard. Great Dark Spot and Red Storm are the two most unique tracks in the game as they step away from the rest of the soundtrack's easily identifiable genres of techno and trance and towards something else. Look, I'm not a music guy, so you'll have to excuse the crude terminology here, but it's got one foot in those aforementioned genres and another planted in an orchestral score. The end result is a soundscape that agitates my flow state when grinding out time trials. Every moment spent here feels tense. Each hot lap feels like a final attack. Every little movement of the sticks feels like it carries dire consequence. And it usually does. On the whole, Mobius is a very simple track, and that's made it easy for the pros to optimise it. To reach their level requires an insane level of precision and dedication. Since I love this track's design and want to actually get a world record in my favourite ship, Mobius has become a hell of my own making. There are days where I can't even think to look at it, and days where I do nothing but race on it. Through thick or thin, it has me hopelessly captivated, and I would have it no other way. Now, as people have been keen to point out to me, Europa was added sometime after the game's release, so for a while Volcano was actually the last environment. Obviously, I'm late to the party, joining sometime in late 2020, but the way Europa keeps bumping up the difficulty, it honestly feels like the perfect conclusion to the game. Surface Sprint is the zenith, the 5th track of the Europa complex, and the last of the base game. It certainly feels like it was designed to be the final boss of Redout. The lore snippet for it supports this idea, but talk is cheap. Does this track live up to the reputation set out by the game's developers? Simply, yes. Yes it does. I absolutely hated Surface Sprint when I first started out, but thanks to muscle memory and constant practice, it's now, well, you can see where it is on the list, can't you? I've had some drastic changes of heart over my career, and Surface Sprint is the biggest. But let's start with why I hated it so much. I've made a few digs already at blind turns in this game, and it's repeated use of them. Surface Sprint was the straw that broke the camel's back for me back in the early days. This mind-bending loop flings you upside down, then right side up at insane speed, and just as you've gotten an inkling of where you are, you have to deal with a completely blind crest, and there are no barriers to cushion you. If you go too far left, you're dead. If you go too far right, you're dead. Going for the middle of the road sounds obvious, but it twists the moment you start going down the hill proper, and you're likely not going to realise it until you're dead. It's deeply vexing, and easily the hardest part of the whole track, but that's not to suggest the rest of it won't gleefully thrash you either. Awkward jumps and tight bends roll a roost here. My initial experiences with Surface Sprint are hardly unique, and I forgive anyone who hates the track regardless of how much they've improved on it. However, between my love for the game and my being unwilling to back down from, most things really, you bet your butt I wasn't going to let Surface Sprint get the better of me. Many crashes later, I got what I wanted. Where clean laps had been so scarce as to be an anomaly, now the inverse was true. I kept taking tenths off my time like I was grating cheese, and yet I was still several seconds off the pace. Some of that would be because of Acera, but surely not all of it. I must have been missing something. And I was. The last thing in the tail of Surface Sprint is a shortcut that almost entirely bypasses its most frustrating section, and presents a brand new one. Now you've got to fly off the track, time it so it's not too early or too late as either will result in a crash, learn which parts of the kill plane aren't bluffing you, and then land on the downward sloping part of the track so you can translate that vertical momentum into horizontal momentum. It's a lot, and I'm still rather uncertain whether this improves on the track or not. I think most of my distaste for it comes purely from how much time I sunk into getting around the track normally, which is now all for naught. There's no denying that it compounds a challenge offered by Surface Sprint, however. The apex of this challenge comes, as ever, from the community. When the weekly races visit this track, it's always an 8-lap race, the maximum that can be set. Its appearance always elicits a mixture of despairing and jubilant cries, and that's before the race even starts. When the lights go out, the track's final and greatest challenge awaits. 8 laps with the cut, without crashing. Consistency is demanded in the extreme, and unless you're a robot, it's far from guaranteed. I already liked Surface Sprint at this point, but the first time I succeeded in doing this, the feeling of euphoria cemented this track as one of my favourites. Surface Sprint is all things to all pilots, a challenge, a meme, an absolute bastard, one of the worst tracks in the game, the ultimate expression of skill. For me, it has been all of those things at some point or another, but now it's one of the best tracks in the game. Redout's always had a very strong identity as a visceral racing game with a high skill ceiling, and Surface Sprint stands as one of its most unflinching examples of that identity. This is a track that's larger than life. That's why it's called Spirit, yeah? It's such a consistently fast track, yet manages to be over a minute long. You get to jump over a massive greenhouse, and then, with little pause, you're flying up the biggest loop in the entire game, which is incidentally the only one that doesn't have any bloody barriers. The rest of the track continues in a similar fashion, being the most blatant visualization of Redout's roller coaster design philosophy. Ludicrously fast, insane degrees of track tilt, stunning spectacle, and just enough points where the ride calms down enough to stop the whole experience from being exhausting. Don't think for a second though that with its emphasis on straight line speed, you can just slap the biggest boosters you can on Sulha and go to town. No, bubbling under that surface is a lot of technical depth that will come to the fore the moment you start joyriding here. Striker also did a video on this track, going in depth about just how much goes into a single lap here. I don't want to step on his toes, nor do I have his penchant for analysis, so instead I will focus on merely the highlights of this track and why they matter. Get comfy, there's a lot of them here. They also start immediately with the first corner, offering the first cut of the track and the first of many obstacles here. That's a lot of firsts. Timing is crucial to veer towards the inside of the corner just as the barrier runs out, letting you fly off, ignore the S section, and land on the straight afterwards. That straight very quickly begins to check out from the Martian surface, and check out from reality as it goes sideways. But the real fun part of this is the jump at the end. Whether you take the intended route, or the fast one, you'll be clearing this greenhouse, and the shortcut makes it even more spectacular, and deadly to boot. You want to exploit gravity to keep your speed up, and land right on top of the boost pad to give you a shunt forward over the next jump. Next we have the aforementioned biggest loop in the game, and there's not much I can add here to explain why it's neat. Actually, what I'm more infatuated with is the bank turn immediately after it. All that camber gives you the courage to take the corner aggressively, and by the time you've made your wall bounce, you're practically out of it already. It's also where one of the most important boosts of the lap occurs. Important for the obvious reason, but also because you need to carry that speed for the best and perhaps most crucial section of the track. Now, a road with such shallow bends normally wouldn't be a problem, but when you tilt it at 90 degrees, add subtle dips and rises in it, and also remove most of the barriers here, it becomes a lot more involved. Who knew? When you hold it against the tried and true dynamics of racing lines, and the Redout community's adage of strafe more, steer less, you begin to see just how difficult it is. You'll be skirting from edge to edge, minimising your steering inputs as much as possible, and even tempting fate by taking a brief jump across the track. It all culminates in a right-hander that is perilous to cut, but as ever must be done as much as possible to get the best run out and onto an actual straight. This section is done in about 8 seconds, but it's a wonderful 8 seconds. The whole of Spirit is a track that makes going fast difficult, and thus fun, but it's this section that epitomises that. Okay, I know I said I was just doing highlights, and what I've done instead seems to just be a play-by-play of every part of the track so far. But honest to God, the entire first half of Spirit is just this good. Fortunately for the sake of time, but unfortunately in every other respect, things go a little bit downhill from here. But that's what happens when you incorporate tubes. Do your best to stay on top, or you're going to quickly find out why this bit sucks. The worst part of the track, immediately following the best part, puts both of them into sharp relief, and it also makes the rest of the track after the tube feels better than it is. That's not to say it's bad, but it's definitely the simplest part of the whole circuit. It's still entirely possible to bottle the lap, so keep to the inside lines, feather the steering, and you'll do just fine. Spirit is an immense track, from top to bottom, start to finish. The only ounce of subtlety it has is in just how deep its difficulty is. It's a werewolf in a sheep's clothing. What I'm trying to say is that it's not exactly beginner friendly to begin with, and only gets worse as time goes on. I love a good challenge though, and if you're worth your salt in Redout, then you should be giving this track a go too. Why do I like Deep Dive? Oh, that's simple. Listen. No, I'm serious, this really is a factor. There's plenty more at play here, but no track has made an impression this strong, this quickly, with one very obvious exception, but we'll get there. Fingertips might be the first volcano track, but Deep Dive feels like the actual introduction. And I mean, what an introduction it is, going right down into the volcano's throat. It's just so perfectly evocative of not only the dangers of this complex, but its spectacle as well. Beyond the abstract, Deep Dive is also an immensely enjoyable track on its own merits. With the initial straight, you'll be wondering how this could go any deeper, before the track swings round into a jump that has you flying even further down to a portal. There's your question answered. The descent continues for a moment more on the other side of the portal, and this is probably where you're going to break your early speed records. However, I feel that sense of speed is only truly felt once you've landed, and your ship is struggling to stay afloat of the track. Cascades of sparks are kicked up, the road blurs by, and it's all you can do to hold on and spot the next corner. As soon as you lay eyes on it, you'll be into it. It's very brusque for the speed you're going at, so you're going to slam into the wall unless you slam on the brakes, but who the hell does that in Redout? Don't slide along the wall too much though, or you'll find out firsthand that Deep Dive doesn't play nice. The sudden dip in the road after also comes without barriers, so the careless and the uninitiated are likely to fly right off and into the magma. Those familiar with the track are more liable to crash into the structure off to the side, because, as tends to be the case whenever barriers aren't present, shortcuts happen, and Deep Dive's only shortcut is nasty. On paper, it's a small skip and a hop, carving out the straightest line from one corner to the next, as any racer wants to do. In reality, so it's a wee bit tricky, but it's worth about 2 tenths and a good chunk of your sanity. When you get it right though, oh my lord, it just feels fantastic. What's less fantastic is the next section of road, which feels like it was drawn out by a child. You're just coming out of the next corner and whoop, your track is now going skywards and upside down simultaneously. The rapid change in the track creates a section that's finicky, hard to keep traction, never mind speed. It's a wee bit annoying, but it doesn't last long enough to be a true nuisance. Plus, as soon as it's over, you're immediately ripping up the track again at Mach 1. For a few seconds anyway. Another slow speed curveball is thrown at you, and despite only having 2 corners, it proves to be more nefarious in the last section, with holes in the walls to catch you out, and tight apexes that will diminish whatever speed you have left. Seeing that boost pad is like seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. That might be a bit dramatic, but in case you hadn't noticed, we're racing inside a fucking volcano. This whole venue is theatrical. And that's the crux of it really. Deep Dive is by no means the most difficult, or sophisticated track in this top 10, but it's got an impeccable sense of occasion about it. From the rivers of magma flying past you as you struggle to keep up with the insane speeds, to the vivid colour palette, to the thumping bass in the background, the operative word here is panic. An urgency to go fast, to navigate the track cleanly, and to try keep your head through all of it. Despite my colourful descriptions thus far, I actually don't fail at the latter part. Where Mobius puts my flow state on tenterhooks, Deep Dive has it melt into a peculiar sort of zen, where I'm content and at peace even as my ship's screaming at roughly 1 billion miles per hour. The end result is a track that has been visited and improved upon as much as Swift Passage, and the satisfaction that comes with it is just as comparable. As I said at the start of this series, and reinforced multiple times over the course of it, first impressions matter a lot. The number 1 spot then, appropriately, sets a fantastic first impression, not only as an individual track, but for the environment it introduces, one that has endured after 300 hours of play. If you've known me for any length of time in the Redout community, or have been paying close attention to the tracks, you'll already know which one this is, so there's no rush in revealing it, is there? Let me be self-indulgent and set the scene as to why this track rates so strongly. As I was muddling through the career with just the base game, I couldn't help but notice events were locked off because I lacked the required DLC. Vertex, Neptune, Sequoia, and Mars. Mars, of course. What better setting for your futuristic racing game than the Red Planet? The little lore snippets lurking in the menus made reference to it as well. Cairo might be the oldest racing complex still active, but Mars is only 2 years younger than it, and was also the testing ground for the pioneers of anti-gravity tech in the first place, ESA. Cairo might be the birthplace of the sport in Redout's world, but Mars? Mars feels like Redout's spiritual home. Hype's a dangerous thing to buy into, regardless of the medium, putting titles on pedestals that in reality are impossible to reach. And yet, in spite of being burned by this repeatedly, I could not help but feel hyped for Mars. It's a location that features frequently in games, but the last time I visited it in the context of a racing game was, LEGO Racers 2, and that came out in 2001. With all the tracks I had visited in the career already, I began to wonder how 34 Big Things would interpret Mars, and how the game's excellent composers would interpret it musically. All the other environments up to that point had tons of personality, even the ships themselves. Surely Mars would be a slam dunk. I couldn't wait long to find out. I bought all the game's DLC and flung myself back into the career. I did each new event in order to give each of the new environments a fair shake, which meant that I denied myself Mars until I got back into Class 3 racing. That gave my fanciful ideas plenty of time to fester, setting my expectations even higher. Mars. Mariner took those expectations and smashed right through them. Seeing the track snake through the foreboding red dunes stretched endlessly into the distance while electric guitars kick into high gear, I was filled with the same sort of adventure that the first Mars colonists must have had, and Mariner ended up being the perfect playground to exercise that enthusiasm. Most Mars tracks clock in at well over a minute, even at Class 4, but Mariner doesn't outstay its welcome. Over a single lap, nearly every aspect of your driving ability is tested through loops, hairpins, S-sections, jumps, elevation and camber changes. It's a greatest hits of the track features Redout employs the most, resulting in a veritable jungle gym of a course. Using all of these staple features runs the risk of Mariner being rather bland in its design, but it avoids this pitfall by blending them in ways that are, at the very least, different enough from all the other tracks. Let's take a look at some examples. Sure, there's a hairpin here, whatever, but you'll be boosting right before it. It's like putting a firecracker in a toilet stall, and then sitting on it. What happens next is nigh on uncontrollable, and requires some serious strength of character to get through it cleanly. Past that section, you've got an array of boost pads to get you back up to speed. Too much speed, again, the chicane afterwards. Of course, you want to go as fast as possible in any circumstance, so you'll have to learn to live with the boost pads and figure out how to navigate the chicane cleanly. Landing on the slope of this hairpin just about scrubs off all of your speed, and you'll be scrambling like mad to get it back and get out of the corner as quickly as possible. From there, it's relatively smooth sailing until you're presented with a vertical jump. The usual principle of carrying as much airtime as possible is now turned up on its head, and subtle adjustments are required to latch onto the track ASAP. Round the loop and the bend, you're presented with a stunning vista of the Martian landscape, and a second or two to admire it before you hurtle back down to the surface. Dust clouds are kicked up behind you as you slide through a flat out corner and into the final part of the lap. Some call this a corkscrew. Me, I call this a helter-skelter on steroids. Try to maintain your speed, your strafe, and your pitch all at once as this road loops round and round, bringing with it numerous changes in the camber that are all subtle but consequential. It's grueling, and it makes the final straight all the more rewarding. It's by no means challenging, but it allows you to blow off some steam after a strenuous lap. There's one element I've been neglecting during this intensely wordy monologue, and that's the music, which is criminal since it's a contributing factor to Mariner's #1 spot. Okay, I know each environment gets 2 music tracks, and Arabia Terra is great in its own right, but Nearby Stars might as well be called the Mariner theme. Both race and music tracks complement each other beautifully, as they are as varied as one another. Nearby Stars in particular ebbs and flows between trippy, uplifting, energizing and intimidating with ease, and it transposes those emotions onto the driving experience itself. I'm no longer just thinking about how to tackle each of the track's obstacles. I'm thinking about it and Mars' history within the game's canon, which spans nearly 100 years. How many untold thousands of drivers have come to this place? All the races that have been held here. How do I stack up among them? Do these ancestral pilots seem a performance as a worthy challenge, or a transgression? Some of you might be thinking, this guy is talking a load of shit, but I promise you this is genuinely how I feel. None of this is put on for the sake of the video. This really is the mental undercurrent raging through my head whenever I visit Mariner. A lot of the top players are very calculated and methodical. I am not one of them. At the end of the day, what matters to me in a game, more than anything, is feel. How do you quantify that? You can't attribute numbers or logic to it. Whether it be the gameplay, the graphics, the aesthetics or the soundscape, I need a game to feel good in at least one of those aspects. Redout often gets all of these right all at once, but they all reach their harmonic peak here at Mariner, the best track in the entire game. And that's that. All of Redout's 60 tracks ranked. I hope you've enjoyed watching this series as much as I've enjoyed making it. I'd like to ask for another minute or 2 of your time before you go though. I just want to give acknowledgements and talk about the channel going forward. Unlike the rest of the series, I'll try to be brief. I had intended to make one other video before Redout 2 came out, a sort of montage to celebrate my time spent in this game and those I've spent it with. I don't have the time to do that now, but I don't want to pass up the celebration either, so in no particular order. Thank you, Dazok, for being the only other die-hard Acera player, and setting the benchmark for me when I started playing. Thank you Ironos for showing what skill and determination can do, even in the worst ship in the game. Thanks to Efiaz for hosting the weekly wall grind on such a consistent basis. Thanks to Striker for the Redout Advanced Strategy Guide series, which you should absolutely give a watch if you're wanting to get better at the game. Thanks to Zoronar for being a class act outside of the track, welcoming and teaching newcomers, and being an utter speed demon when the lights go out, and also for helping me with the introduction to this part. And finally, but certainly not least, thank you for joining me on this extremely self-indulgent journey. Speaking of journeys, the channel. I'm wanting to do more with it. The most immediate and relevant item is Redout 2 of course. I intend to do a day 1 stream of it, and start outputting videos once some time has passed. This isn't the only game I'd like to talk about however, and I'm planning to branch out to reviewing other games. So if racing isn't your thing, there might still be something for you here in the coming months. Okay, that covers it all. I've been Rokinath, this has been my Redout Ranking, and I hope to see you all in the next video.